I'm Kim Bremer, your host today for another edition of Bova News, keeping you up to date on the cattle industry's latest in technology, management, genetics, and more. It goes without saying that managing labor on the dairy is critically important. Not only does it represent a significant investment for the business, but creating the processes and culture that encourages employee growth and development is vital to getting jobs and tasks completed efficiently and correctly. Today, we'll hear from 4 experts in managing labor teams who will walk us through how to make sure the regulatory aspects are met, but also how to establish protocols and culture that encourages employee growth and development. Our first presenter today is Shaun Hardtke. He's the Director of Milk Quality and Safety with FutureCow, which covers a global territory and provides technical support to dairies revolving around protocol compliance, hands-on and classroom training, and organizing on-farm systems and structures. Shaun comes with a lifetime of dairy experience, most recently moving to FutureCow after 16 years of managing an 8,000 cow dairy along with leading 50 employees in Northeast Wisconsin. He grew up on a 100 cow dairy on the shores of Lake Michigan, just outside of Green Bay, Wisconsin. Welcome, Shaun.
So good afternoon, everybody. My section here is on a little bit of labor management, some of the little ideas that I've kind of experienced over the course of my time managing my dairy. Some of the things that are extremely costly to any dairy or any business for that matter. Protocol drift. It is so costly in animal health, performance, barn damages. It reduces efficiency and is absolutely demoralizing to all of our other employees. As far as anything from parlor compliance, barn compliance, feeding, feeding quality, if you're mixing your rations right, what's in front of the cow. As far as little things as putting post-tip on the cows, so important. Starts from day one, prevention and setting the standard. So what we need to do is we need to set our culture from the first time we speak to a potential hire, and we need to, in order to make them understand what is expected of each person that joins our team. At that time, we need to be firm, absolutely firm in providing our clarity and our expectations within our business. What we want to do, we want to instill a little sliver of authority, but we also want to make somebody feel welcome, excited, and comfortable in wanting to join our team. So as the industry all knows, labor is very hard to come by. And the last thing we want to do is infuse a bad apple into our teams. So don't be afraid to pass on somebody that you don't feel comfortable would be a good fit. Don't hire just a body. Setting the standard from day one, that first time that person punches in, we need to set the bar for our organization. And that gives the employee a notion of how things operate within your organization and what your expectations are. What we need to do is we need to get them to drink the Kool-Aid of why they have joined your team, okay? And we need to show them our professional side. We need to show them how we act, how we treat them, how we teach them, how we talk to others, okay? Our employees are not blind to these things, like they totally see it. What we need to do is we need to give people the benefit of the doubt. And we need to give them clarity. Most people want to do the right thing. So keeping close tabs on new individuals. We want to be sure that they're going to be the right fit for your business, but we need to also gauge our level of trust with them. So that goes both ways. And then provide that ever so important clarity and judgment. We need to provide it early. We need to provide it often. Providing clarity weeds out the bad apples. So that right from the day one, that has to start. The business needs our judgment. So be fully involved in every part of your business to make it a success. And don't be afraid to have those hard conversations in order to ward off and redirect compliance issues from day one. Okay. Training, testing, and enforcing. We need more teachers in this world and less bosses that run as the authoritative dictator boss. This is an extremely fine line to walk, but we need to provide testing, and it needs to be done early and often in the form of formal evaluations based upon objective metrics and not necessarily opinions. Even little spot checks. Okay, so as we're walking around the dairy, just little spot checks, just have a conversation, move on with life, but remember it, record it, move on so that we have something legally to be enforced in the future if things do go south. Coaching and mentoring. What we're doing now, we need to farm through our people It is important to provide this to individuals of our team at any one stage of our career, of someone's career. We need to focus on 2 types of coaching, okay? Redirecting, which would be like poor or suboptimal performance. And then we need to have coaching that's based upon forward growth. So building people up and growing them. We need to know when to coach and how and when to give up. So what is the right time? Where are we at with this person's career? Okay. We need to coach when the attitude and the drive is there. We need to provide that orientation and training from day one. But we also need to, we have to do our part for the employee and for the business and provide them with the right tools for growth. And then the not so popular redirection part of their career, if it comes to that point. We need to give up and part ways with someone when they're not putting forth their best efforts anymore after one heck of a fight to save a person that has failed, okay? So obviously don't just give up on somebody. People are not expendable. People are not just bodies, right? Like we need to provide that personal connection. And in order to get to somebody's mind, to make them succeed, we have to go through the heart to get to the mind, okay? And then mentorship needs to happen in order to grow our businesses, but also make our life a lot easier so we can spend time with family or do whatever we prefer to do on our spare time, if we have any. Creating a structure and a vision for your people, okay? For our teams. What we need to do is we need to work diligently to create and enforce a system that everyone can understand upon, okay? We need to know where they are as far as work performance, as well as the employee needs to know where they're at. We need to provide formal evaluations from both the past and the current, and then also make a path for the future and how to get there. But we also need to turn the table around a little bit. We need to put it in the employee's shoes. We want to know where they want to be in life, but we also want to know what can we do to help them get there. We need to create a vision, and then we need to create a vision and help them get to that point in life to help them succeed, which is going to make our business succeed. Okay. And thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Shaun. Our next presenter is Michelle Shambeau. She has a heart for agriculture and working with people. Growing up on a dairy farm in Two Rivers, Wisconsin, she's been with the Ebert family of businesses for 2 years as their HR manager. The Ebert family of businesses includes the farm, Ebert Enterprises, custom smoked meat, Salmon's meat products acquired in 2020, and a restaurant, Homestead Kitchen and Tap set to open this month. With these 3 businesses comes 145 dedicated and caring employees representing 6 countries. Welcome, Michelle.
Thanks, Kim, and thanks for having me. So as Shaun just talked more on the day-to-day side of things, I'm really going to speak from the HR side of things. I am a human resource professional on the dairy farm. And as I stated in my bio, I started with Ebert Enterprises in 2019. And really from the HR side of things, I get to help orchestrate and oversee everything regarding labor management. So that can entail anything from recruitment to evaluations to benefits to compensation and everything in between. And to give you a little idea of my background or maybe our culture, Ebert Enterprises, we have about 90 employees here on the farm. And I started here in 2019, and we have grown from 1 company to now 3 companies. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that journey because it looks totally different now than what it did in 2019. But from our culture standpoint, just so you can kind of understand our context, is we are very big on collaboration and communication. From employee to manager, manager to ownership, and everything in between. We're very big on collaboration and communication. We're also big on creating a career path and really having that internal growth to allow employees, hopefully a future here and something they see growing into. And we like to do that by being very understanding and probably allowing a lot of opportunities to learn and grow, which can have its own challenges in itself, but we are a very understanding culture. And I think our care for our employees go past the daily job. We are there to help folks when they are looking to find an apartment, or maybe they have a family member that is not doing so hot. We really care for our employees past their job. And I think what's pretty special about that is that comes from our owners, Randy and Renee Ebert. And it starts from the top and trickles throughout. And we often hear from Randy and Renee that it's okay to fail. We're gonna make mistakes. We have never owned a meat shop before. We've never opened a restaurant before, which I'll get into a little bit more. So we're gonna fail. We're gonna make mistakes, and that's okay. That's part of the process. So from an HR side of things, I really get to work with owners. I work with the managers and with employees. So I know every 145 employees that we have, and I feel very privileged to be able to know each of them by name and get to work with them on a daily basis. So some of the things that we specifically do is we do the 90-day chats, which Shaun talked about, or the yearly evaluations. We also provide trainings. So a lot of times I'm not the one doing the training, but I am the one that is creating that training process, and to make sure that we're all up and ready to go. We're lining up speakers and such like that. We also do, we've tried doing educational days in which we have had like a feed day or a hoof trim day. And that really allows employees who maybe want to grow into that role in the future to try it out, to see what they like. It also allows the managers to see when an employee jumps in there, how they're doing, what their skill set is. So some of them have been well received, some there hasn't been much interest in, but we're trying it. And like I said, I've been with the farm for 2 years. So this is something we've tried. We may not continue, but we like to be able to pivot and really do or try what we need to by listening to our employees and what they're asking for. A way in which I feel from HR side of things of how I stay up to date on regulatory and different protocol topics would be, we have legal counsel. So you'll be hearing from both Troy and Eric. We have our own legal counsel in which we will seek out to make sure we're doing things up to snuff. I also will seek out SHRM, which is a Society of Human Resource Management, and will research certain topics. I think also getting educated through webinars like Bova News or attending seminars or conferences really allows me to make sure that we are following things from a compliance side and making sure that I'm submitting everything I need to, and making sure that I'm keeping our employees, our owners, and everyone safe from a compliance side at the farm. I think in my 2 short years here, when I started back in June of 2019, we had 70 employees. And you'll see that this journey has been a fast growth here. So we are double that right now. We have about just over 90 on the farm right now. We have 30 when we purchased Salmon's meat products, and that was 30 employees that we have added to our mix of things. So that would be, the farm would be agriculture, Salmon's would be manufacturing, food manufacturing. And then what's pretty exciting is this June in 21, we are adding a restaurant to the mix, which is Homestead Kitchen and Tap. So if you're ever in Northwest Wisconsin, we would welcome you to the restaurant and would hope that you'd stop in and have a beverage or dinner or appetizer. We look forward to seeing you. And with that 2 years of growth, so we started at 70 employees. We are now up to 145, probably soon to be 150. And with the HR side of things, it is really listening to our employees and what they need and being able to pivot if they're not getting what they need. We listen and we try to provide what they're asking for and what they're seeking out. I think my role specifically, I probably would talk about 3 main pillars. And I think that you can do this if you have an HR professional at your farm, But I know before I came, some of the HR responsibilities were shared throughout other individuals on the farm. So maybe this is something that you could implement through one person or multiple people. So that first pillar, I would say, would be encouraging consistency. I want to make sure that each employee is being treated relatively the same. They're getting that same attention. They're getting that opportunity to give feedback through evaluations. They're receiving training. And oftentimes through our handbook process, they're all hearing a very similar message. So that is my first pillar, is that I get to encourage consistency. My second pillar would be that I help mitigate risk. There are a lot of things that we need to make sure that we are reporting or recording. And some of that is the documentation from certain employee conversations. It is also when an employee starts that we make sure that we have an I-9 for each employee. It can also be with some of our health reporting. We have to do 1095s or 1094s with the ACA. And then also providing FMLA or COBRA paperwork. I know a lot of acronyms, a lot of numbers, but just really helping mitigate risk and make sure that I'm supporting the dairy or the meat processing location or the restaurant, making sure that I can lower that risk whenever I can. So my third pillar is probably my favorite. And that would be, I truly get to be a culture ambassador. And I think so true to who we are is what Randy and Renee have instilled in us, being able to not be perfect and make mistakes and have a career path that you can pave for yourself, and having open and honest communication. That is something I hold near and dear and I feel is pretty special. So the fact that I get to be a culture ambassador and help from a labor a labor management side of things, and make sure that all employees are having that outlet to share, or that they are, if their morale maybe isn't what it normally is, being there to check in and be like, how you doing? How can I help? It's pretty special. So that is the pillar that I do not take lightly, because it definitely fills my bucket. So I just wanted to leave you with those three pillars. And what I think is pretty cool, that I got to share with you my 2-year journey. And I would hope that if I am asked to do a webinar in 2023, that I will be able to tell you a whole slew of new things, because we are continuing to adjust and pivot where needed. And I think that only has good things to come. So thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Okay, we're going to switch gears a little bit as we hear from two attorneys as our next presenters. Troy Schneider is a partner with the firm of Twohig, Rietbrock, Schneider and Halbach in Chilton, Wisconsin, and specializes in the areas of real estate, business, and estate planning. Troy received his law degree from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's a past member of the board of the Solo Small Firm and General Practice section and past chair of its Agricultural Rural Practice Committee. Troy is also a member of the American Agricultural Law Association. Troy's family continues to operate a 3,500 head steer and heifer farm in eastern Wisconsin. Welcome, Troy.
Thank you, Kim. Today, I want to just touch upon very briefly a basic overview of farm employment laws. When you represent farms and agribusinesses in their business planning, how the laws as it relates to employees comes up all the time. And employment law is one of those areas where it seems like it's just hidden, full of hidden landmines. So I wanted to kind of provide this today a little bit of overview of some basic employment laws and hopefully some takeaways that our farm business owners and agribusiness owners can take with them. So first of all, it's important to realize that the presumption under the law is that everybody working on your farm is an employee at will. And in a nutshell, an employee at will means that you can hire and fire whomever you wish and whenever you wish. Well, as you know, with every rule under the law, there are exceptions. And you can actually create under the law an exceptions by what they call a contractual exception to the employee at will doctrine. And courts have actually determined that contracts for employment were established even when there was no written contract, that it was implied that there was a contract. And when an employer fires an employee who the courts would say had an employment contract, they could be subject to pretty severe legal consequences in the form of a breach of contract claim or a wrongful discharge claim. So how do these contractual exceptions to employment at will, how do they come about? Well, some jobs, and typically higher level jobs, you can do a written employment contract with your employee. Like I said, many times in managerial type of positions, the manager or the employer have a written contract. And so there could be exceptions that are written into that contract about exceptions to the employment at will. However, even if there's not a written employment contract, there can be in employment contracts that the court implies from the actions of the employer. So that's why how you recruit and what are some of the things you have said during your recruitment process of an employee are very, very important. Also, what's written in the handbooks and policies and manuals. If you have something that would even hint at that you're offering employment other than through the employment at will doctrine, the courts could infer that there is a contractual relationship between you and the employee. And also, you have to be careful as to establish not that there's a just cause standard implied under your employment. So not only is there also exceptions, contractual exceptions to the employment at will doctrine, there's also exceptions to the employment at will doctrine that are under the law. So, for example, as a public policy standpoint, there are certain laws that have been put in place that rebut the presumption that you're an employee at will. So, for example, one of the things that the law protects is people who are quote unquote whistleblowers. That if you are telling somebody, a public agency, that you are legally whistleblowing on an employer, you could be let go. And if you are let go, that you could be subject to potentially a wrongful discharge type of claim. Also, as many of you are aware, both federal and state laws prohibit firing because of sex, race, sex, age, disability, religion, national origin, ancestry, marital status, arrest and conviction records, and sexual orientation. You cannot let someone go or terminate someone because of those reasons. There are many laws that limit the employment at will doctrine, and some of those include, the civil rights types of laws, the American with Disabilities types of laws, the Fair Labor Standards laws, the OSHA laws, all provide protections from employees from being terminated if they're acting under the protections under those particular laws. Also, Wisconsin has adopted laws regarding personnel rules and regulations regarding personal records, personal grooming, HIV testing, and genetic testing. All those laws limit the kinds of things that can be requested from an employer to an employee. So given all that, given the, just a broad explanation of the employment at will doctrine under the law, and how that there are both exceptions, both that can be created through things that the employer does him or herself through their actions, or the exceptions written into the law itself. I want to shift gears for a second and provide just some recommendations for HR managers on on how they deal, on how they should handle employment matters. So first of all, you should really, I encourage HR managers to review their hiring processes. You know, make sure that your documents you use for hiring, either employment applications, interview questions, etc., that they clearly state that the person you are hiring is an employee at will. Also, carefully inquire as to health conditions relative to the job being offered. You don't want to be subject to a claim of that you are discriminating against that person because of their health conditions. Make sure that you review, like I said, your employment application form. Clarify that a good driving record is essential for the position and will adversely affect continued employment. Have your applicant on his or her application form sign a verification statement that all the information that they're providing is accurate. Also, have them sign a authorization and release statement that gives you authority to inquire from others with regard to the things they've written on their application form, and whether they're, so you can verify that of the truthfulness. And again, review and update any pre-employment inquiries, reference checks, and any testing procedures. Also, make sure that you review your employee handbooks, policies, manuals, and practices, and then make sure to schedule a periodic review of that employee as well, too, as both of our two previous presenters had discussed. So, going through for a second, one other recommendation I have for HR managers is to review your employee handbook. So an employee and many farms have employee handbooks. And from my perspective, and just based upon my experience, a well-written employee handbook can be your best friend. A poorly written handbook can be your worst enemy. So be careful. So carefully review your employee handbook content. For example, number one, remove any limitations on the employer's ability to discharge employees. Second, describe salary and fringe benefits as weekly or biweekly rather than annual. Again, you don't want to imply that somebody is entitled to that position, but use words such as annual. Number three, reserve the right to modify anything in the employee contract, including the disciplinary process. Four, consider establishing a substance abuse policy with a proper and legal procedure. Also, five, establish rules regarding good driving records and how it's a requirement for continued employment. And six, establish a disciplinary policy for the company and set up a process on how that disciplinary process goes. And then finally, make sure that your employee handbook complies with all the laws that are written, and instruct all your managers that there are no verbal assurances to continue employment with the company. Again, we want to do nothing to rebut that presumption of the employment at will status. And then also make sure that all of your employee records are adequate and comply with the law. For example, and Eric will touch on, I'm sure, the I-9 form and what is legally required there. Photocopy all documents for the employee file, and keep a written documentation of all policy violations and disciplinary actions you have taken with regard to the employee. Again, it's so important in the employment law field to document. And documenting when the event is occurring is so important, rather than documenting it after a great deal of time has passed after the event has occurred. And so finally, I want to just touch upon a little bit about, let's talk a little bit about finally about firing. And there are two types of firing. Either, as you know, either there's a voluntary termination, which means a quit, and then involuntary termination, which is a discharge. What often employers don't realize is that sometimes, even though they think that their employee has quit, things can be implied under the law that there was a constructive discharge. And examples of constructive discharge include reducing an employee's salary, substantially reducing their hours. And then if the employee finally quits, the employer might be surprised to learn that it actually is considered a terminate or discharge rather than a quit. Also, make sure to go through it when you are thinking about terminating an employee. Go through a checklist of make sure that all of you have done everything proper. And that checklist could include or ask yourself these questions. Could it be found that the firing was made because the employee was a member of an ethnic minority, a woman, a person over 40 years of age, or sexual orientation or religion? Those protected class type of reasons. Were there any written or oral promises made to the employee during the hiring process or employment to imply that they are anything other than an employee at will? Third, does the company's handbook or any policy contain statements or guarantees regarding employment? So make sure that there's nothing in there that you're running afoul of when you decide to terminate an employee. Are there any public policy concerns or state or federal laws that we have to be considered of before we let this employee go? Also, could it be construed that I, as the employer, are retaliating against this as employer because they did file a workers' compensation type claim or a discrimination claim or what have you? Those are all going to be lawful termination. That could also be determined that could very well be determined that you're unlawfully terminating that person. And was the employee providing a fair warning of possible disciplinary actions for the conduct they received? Again, that's where documenting the employee file is so very important. And is the reason for the employer's termination related to the operation of the business? And can the company reasonably determine that the employee did in fact violate the policies and procedures of the company? And finally, you as the employer, before you ask yourself, it's really important. Sometimes employees who fight a termination are going to say that they were not equally treated among employees. So make sure if you do establish a policy that it's applied across the board among all employees. So and finally, when you do terminate with someone, and if you do have any questions about whether you can terminate this employee or not, call your attorney or call somebody that can provide you legal advice on whether you are potentially violating the law. And that's what I just, a very broad overview today is just some employment laws that you'd be mindful of when you hire your farm employees, let your farm employees go, and that's it for today.
Our final presenter today is Erich Straub. Erich is an immigration lawyer who practices in Wisconsin and is listed in the Best Lawyers in America and U.S. News and World Report's Best Law Firms. Erich has spoken to audiences throughout the U.S. on immigration and frequently advises dairy producers on the topic. Welcome, Erich.
Hello. So, in terms of current laws and procedures that I think people need to be aware of, it's a tough time to advise dairy producers, or quite frankly, anybody else that is touched by immigration, kind of what's going on, because there are just huge changes that are happening as a result of the new presidential administration. And, much more so than would be typical, because we're going from very two stark visions of immigration, both employment immigration and the plight of undocumented individuals in this country. So I think that the most productive thing for producers to focus on in this sort of time of uncertainty is I-9 compliance. Again, the form, the I-9, I'm sure you're all aware of it. It's the form that you have to give your employees once you hire them. And they're required, when you give them that form, to give you identification that proves that their identity as well as their eligibility to work in the United States. And those are records that you're required to maintain. And the reason that you're required to maintain them is because they're subject to audit at any time by the federal government. So that is one area that we know is not going to substantially change in terms of your requirements to keep those records. There are many other things that are on the list of things to reform. And so I think we're in a pretty safe place in focusing on I-9s. So I'm going to go to the I-9 inspection and just talk about what an inspection is. We really can't, we don't have the time to go through the form and sort of the nitty-gritty details of how you fill it out. You know, there's some resources out there that the federal government has in terms of an employer handbook. But my guess is most of you are familiar just from the instructions of the form and your own use and practice in terms of how that form works and how you fill it out. So let's talk about the situation where you're actually being inspected and audited. And, you know, you're not going to normally get anything other than a knock at the door and an ICE agent that's going to show you that they have a warrant for all of your I-9s. And that visit, a lot of times people ask me, well, what prompts that visit? And so I've represented numerous individuals, including dairy producers, large and small dairy producers in terms of I-9 audits before. I've also represented other employers. And the most common thread that I can see for I-9 investigations over the last decade in terms of a trigger point is an employee who gets put into removal proceedings. And removal proceedings are the legal term for deportation proceedings, which is the more common term that people are familiar with. So if you have an employee, you may not even be aware of it, who goes into deportation proceedings. It can be an ex-employee, and they list you as one of their employers in the process of talking to ICE. Then in the past, you have been on the radar screen for a potential I-9 inspection. You typically get a notice of inspection from the ICE agent. You have 72 hours to respond to that. They will attempt to ask you if you want to waive the 72 hours. That's never a good idea for reasons that I'll go into a little bit later. Once you have turned over your I-9s to ICE, you will eventually get a response from them, and you'll be in one of two situations. You don't have any issues because all of your I-9s were correctly filled out, and all of the people that are in your I-9s are who they say they are, and they are authorized to work. But the more common situation, of course, particularly in this industry, is that there are violations, and the violations fall into two areas: technical violations, which are typically violations in terms of how you have filled out the form, and then the more serious, which are substantive violations. And substantive violations mean that the person that is represented on the I-9 form is either not the individual that they claim to be, or are not authorized to work, or both. All right. So once you get notice of those, you have 10 days to correct those technical and substantive violations. You then return your I-9 forms to ICE, and then ICE eventually comes back with a recommendation to a prosecutor, and the prosecutor makes a recommendation as to fines that are going to be implemented. There are criminal liabilities potentially in an I-9 audit, but those usually come into play where we have repeated violators, or there is some type of conspiracy that may be going on to that the employer is involved in to actually recruit workers that they know are not authorized to work. So those are the two more common situations for criminal. The vast majority of I-9 audits are handled civilly with fines. The fines are substantial. I would say over the last 4 years, fines for employers that I have represented have ranged anywhere from $25,000 up to $75,000, $80,000. So it's by violation, and there is a graph that they use to determine how they're going to figure out what the fine is per violation. So we don't, again, not something we have time to go into today. Hopefully you don't get into that situation. But let's talk about how you can prepare potentially for I-9 audits. One, there's a list of documents that they're typically going to ask for, and I have that in one of the slides, which is, they're going to ask for your Form I-9s, but they also are going to ask for your payroll records at the time that they're the period of time that they're inspecting, tax statements on your Form 943, any prior SSA no match letters, which quite frankly, a lot of employers don't keep. They're not required to, but if you have them, you're supposed to turn them over. Federal contracts that you may have, subcontractors that you may work with for employees, temporary employment agencies that you may work with for employees, your business licenses, and your articles of incorporation. So if you wanted to have a laundry list of things that you might want to have ready in case this happens to you, that would be the list of typical things that are subpoenaed as a result of the audit. Surviving an I-9 audit, all right? Again, first rule of thumb is never waive the 72 hours, no matter how honest or nice or cooperative the agent wants to make you see, because it's really critical at that point for you to pull those records together and take the amount of time that you have to respond. You do want to be cooperative. Now, you don't want to give an agent full access to your property, your farm, so they can go talk to people. I mean, essentially, that warrant authorizes them to serve it on you, and you have 72 hours in which to respond. So it's not a warrant that gives them access to your property, to your operations, to speak to your employees. It's very rare that they have a warrant that extends to that level. A typical I-9 audit is only going to be for your documents. So don't let them roam, all right? They can serve the paperwork, you can thank them, you can tell them that you're going to be in touch with your attorney and you will be responding within the 72 hours after you've been served with the notice. You want to engage in minimal conversation with them. You do not want to answer questions about your I-9 forms, your employees, or your hiring practices at that point, okay? You want to hire an attorney if it gets to this level. Very few people hire me to actually do an internal or private audit. Most people hire me after they are served with the subpoena. And the reason that you want to hire an attorney is there are serious legal consequences. The fines are very significant. ICE agents are experts at doing this. They know this much better than you ever could. And probably most importantly is you really need a third-party communication shield between you and the agent, because anything that comes out of your mouth, any actions that you take, are potentially evidence against you in a civil or in a criminal proceeding that more than likely is going to occur if you've started to go down the I-9 audit and it's been initiated against you, unless you're 100% squeaky clean and you don't end up with anybody who is not authorized to work. My experience with dairy operations is usually when they get hit, we're looking at probably 80% of their workforce is probably going to get knocked out. So that's my rule of thumb based on my past experience. So having that communication shield of an attorney who's going to handle all communications from that point on with the agents is absolutely critical to limit your legal liability. And then this one is really, I think, under emphasized. I emphasize it heavily from day one when somebody contacts me and whenever I talk to dairy producers. You need a business contingency plan. And if I was going to tell you to do anything as a result of my talk with you today, I would tell you to have a business contingency plan. So you really need to not sit around and speculate how many of your employees you really think are authorized to work and how many might have given you fake documentation. That's not what I'm telling you to do. I'm just telling you to take my rule of thumb of about 80% of your workforce is going to get knocked out in an I-9 audit. What are you going to do when that occurs? What are you going to do to keep your business running and afloat? What type of contingency plan are you going to be putting into place? And with dairy producers, it is really it's not just a legal issue, but it's a humanitarian issue. I mean, you've got animals, you've got animal welfare that you need to take care of. They have to be milked 3 times a day. And so you have a major animal welfare crisis on your hand, depending on the size of your operation. Quite frankly, whether it's small or whether it's large, it just depends on how big the problem is. But you have a major animal welfare problem on your hand. And so you need to, if you haven't already, think through how would I deal with 80% of my workforce being gone within a couple weeks. All right. Again, you have 10 days after they come back and let you know who is authorized and who is not to respond. One of the things that I'm typically successful in is getting that lengthened. They were a lot harder on that in the previous administration. There was more flexibility in prior administrations, and I hope that there will be in this one as well. So, but it's still, you got to have that business contingency plan in place if you really, really want to plan. General practice pointers on I-9, you're required to retain the documents in I-9 3 years from the date of hire or 1 year from the date of termination, whichever is later. You need to be consistent with your documents. It's always best to have one person doing the I-9s rather than just handing it off to whoever happens to be there in the business office. Have one person do it, have them do it consistently. Photocopy documents. Years ago, the common advice was not to photocopy documents. I tell people to photocopy documents because a lot of technical violations can be cured and the fines will be less as a result of that if you have photocopies of the documents and they're just errors in terms of writing the information on the document down on the I-9 form. And again, be consistent. There's the M274 handbook for employers that's available on USCIS's website if you want their advice for how to deal with I-9s and do things the correct way. I also have a video on my website that talks about how to deal with I-9 audits. And it's a little dated at this point. I think we made it about 10 years ago, but quite honestly, the way you deal with them hasn't really changed that much in the last decade. So, that is I-9 compliance. I'll just touch on 2 things briefly. A lot of people the last 4 years have been dealing with Social Security no-match letters. As most of you probably know at this point, or have heard from your fellow producers, after more than a decade of disappearing, the Social Security no-match letter made a roaring comeback in the Trump administration in 2018. There was, as far as I can tell, an extremely poorly thought out plan to start issuing Social Security no-match letters. I think at first they really intended people to have to report back and employers to have to take a more active role. And then I don't know what the official reason is, but I expected once this came out, seeing how poorly planned it was, that there would be a major political blowback to it. And I think that is in fact what happened. And I think that the administration backed off. My guess is it was probably an idea probably from Stephen Miller, who is famous for ill thought out ideas in terms of immigration, and the blowback happened. And so the SS no match letters just sort of disappeared. My advice to employers was sort of wait and see, do the basic, follow through with what the notice requires you to do. But there appears to have been no consequences. People called the number that was on the notice. A lot of times the government didn't get back to them. So the interesting thing is the SSA no match letters continued though in 2019, and then there was the last wave of them in 2020. And as far as I could tell at that point, it was just kind of a scare tactic so that employers had to deal with them. They had an obligation to inform their employees of the no match letter. And I think the hope of whoever came up with the idea was, well, we can't actually enforce it, but by sending them out, we will scare employers and we will scare employees, and either employees will quit in response or employers will fire them in response. And that will be a good thing because we will probably be knocking out some people who are undocumented and not authorized to work. So I do not expect the Social Security no match letters to continue under the Biden administration. It was something that the Obama administration went away from. A poorly executed plan to revise them under the Trump administration. I think they're gone, at least as long as this administration lasts. I do not think there will be any major legal consequences for letters that you have now. A future administration could, of course, use your lack of response to them as a part of an investigation into whether you knowingly hired unauthorized workers. But again, we're getting pretty tenuous in terms of your legal risk, in my opinion. So that's the SSA no match letters. And I'm sure that as a part of the questions today, that somebody is going to ask me if things are going to get any better and if dairy producers are going to have a visa now that we have a new administration. So I'll wait and answer that when we go to questions.
Okay, well, thank you, Eric. So we do have some questions for the four of you, and I think Eric let you kind of take off, or you left off there. You know, in terms of immigration law under the new administration, you alluded to it a little bit. Any changes that producers should expect to see?
No changes in the law. Changes in the way the current law is implemented. So I'm the big bad bear of bad news. You know, the problem remains that Congress is the only body that can make laws in this country. The president can change how laws and regulations are implemented. And so the Biden administration is handcuffed largely in terms of the current law and in terms of making changes. So an example of that would be, I fully expect that they are not going to pursue Social Security no match letters. You're going to see those disappear. So that's an example of how the Biden administration can and probably will change things in terms of dairy producers. I have no idea what they're going to do with I-9 audits and investigations. I would expect that they're going to be a part of enforcement in some capacity, but I really don't know at this point. They have not sent a clear signal there. In terms of immigration reform that would help dairy producers, we're just not there. I mean, the magic number is 60 votes in the Senate. You all may remember once upon a time we had 68 votes, and unfortunately we never got a day where it was voted on in the House because the speaker at that time did not bring it up for a vote. And so that's where we remain, and we are much further away from 60 votes than we probably have ever been. My expectation would be that the only thing that's going to pass Congress this year is probably going to be through the reconciliation process, other than the rare bipartisan bill like the one you saw yesterday on economic and security issues in China. But reconciliation, for those of you who don't know, is a budgetary process, and so it only requires 51 votes to pass the Senate. The problem with reconciliation is it's strictly limited to budgetary items, and in order to even proceed on it, you've got to have your own caucus's 50 votes in terms of an agreement that immigration would be an important policy in terms of putting it into reconciliation. Now, personally, I think that's a real stretch. But I absolutely know that, the critical vote, Joe Makin is not going to go for that. I mean, I just can't see that in a million years. So I think that reform for now is not going to happen, and we're probably all going to have to content ourselves with what happened with COVID relief and what happened with hopefully what's going to happen with an infrastructure bill. I still think that has a decent chance of passing through reconciliation, but I doubt much else does. It's an open question as to whether, quite frankly, the Senate parliamentarian would allow an immigration bill to go through reconciliation. So unfortunately, it kind of puts us in the same place. Now, that's the bad news. The good news is that you're not going to see the type of enforcement and sort of fear. I mean, for a while, I know producers were losing workers not because ICE was showing up at the farm, but just because people were just scared and they decided to go home. And so we're not going to be in that type of environment. Clearly, ICE has been defanged for right now. So, that's about the best news that I can give you in terms of what's going to happen, presumably over the next 3.5 years.
How about what's going to end up happening with overtime rules? Do you want to tackle that, or Troy?
That's a good question. AG has enjoyed some leeway when it comes to overtime rules. We seem to be on a path of anti-employers, so nothing would surprise me whether there are some changes made. So, in my opinion.
And where do you see the trend going in terms of labor costs?
My personal opinion is not shockingly is higher labor costs. I think the labor market is too tight because of various reasons. Government policies that have put in place with regard to unemployment benefits, et cetera. I think it has created a tighter labor market.
So shifting gears just a little bit, Shaun, you talked a little bit about protocol drift and how that robs producers of efficiency, profitability. What are a few things that producers can do through training, or maybe more importantly, follow-up, to reduce protocol drift? How do you address it?
Yeah, most definitely get people to buy your Kool-Aid of your organization, number one, but explain the whys behind what we do. Don't just tell people this is what we have to do, but we need to understand and teach the cow science behind things. It's a lot of work, but it pays off in the end. It really does. I've seen it time and time again.
And let's talk a little bit about employee retention. It's an important aspect of any business. It's obviously important for our dairies. What are some of the biggest challenges you faced with retaining employees, and what did you do to address it?
Usually it always comes down to a lack of communication at the end of the day. Usually there's a gap somewhere in the system, whether it's on the top or the bottom of the totem pole, but it comes down to communication. You can never over talk enough to an employee individually or as a group of employees. I think that, like I said, you almost want to get to the point where you think you're over communicating, and that's probably where you want to be all the time. Almost not to the point of annoying to an employee, but just keep the open lines going.
And how about you, Michelle? What do you do for employee retention? Biggest challenges that you faced with retaining employees, and what have you done about it?
So I would say our biggest challenge is we are in a high dairy community. And so from a retention standpoint, there's a lot of opportunity to work on dairies right in our backyard. So we are extremely cognizant of that. I think a way in which we've looked to how we can do that, we don't only compare ourselves to other ag organizations. We really look at other industries and how we're setting ourselves apart. as an employer and what benefits we're offering and how we can provide that for future employees.
And lastly, you also touched on coaching and mentoring. It's effective in employee development. How do you decide who gets coached and who gets mentored?
So I'm in the belief that I feel everyone has the opportunity for both. Now, if we're talking coaching from more a discipline side of things, I think that's more situational. But I really feel that we're trying to create a culture in which everyone has that opportunity to get mentored. And I think a way in which we're trying to equip some of our managers, myself, is we're also building that external circle as well. So working with a coach, I work with Christy Pagel through GPS Dairy, and she's been extremely helpful from my side of things. I know from our herd manager standpoint, she is mentored or helped with our nutritionist and our veterinarian. So we really work to do that internal coaching and mentoring, but then we also build who's around us to help make sure we're staying sharp and providing our employees with what's needed.
And Shaun?
Yeah, definitely. I would agree. Everybody deserves to be coached and mentored. But it comes down to attitude, right? And progress. Does that person, do they have the right attitude? Number one, that's where you decide which way you're going to go with things. If they've got the right attitude, but they obviously can't perform something, get to the root cause of what's failing, right? Can they physically not do it? Do they just not comprehend something? If that's the case, work with them. Find a different position on the dairy within the organization. Let's just be human with everybody, honestly, right? Let's be flexible and let's all work together, I think.
My thanks to the four of you today for joining us and sharing your invaluable expertise and experience. Don't forget to subscribe to the Bova News channel on YouTube, find our Bova News podcast on your favorite listening platform, or find more information at bovanews.com. Thanks for tuning in with us today. We'll see you next time on another edition of Bova News.